In this lesson, we'll gather the scene from this sketch. At first, we'll model all the objects in the individual scenes and then put everything together. Let's start with this shoe. For those who aren't familiar with Cinema 4D, I'll run through the interface briefly. To control the camera, you have to hold down Alt and click the second mouse button to zoom, the first mouse button to rotate the camera, and the third mouse button to pan. You can find the standard primitives in this area. If you click and hold, you'll see a list of other primitives. Let's create a cube. As you can see, it appeared in the viewport and in this list. This is the Object Manager, and all the objects will appear in it. You can see the Attributes Manager below. Here are the attributes of the selected object. In this case, I have a cube selected, and I can edit some parameters. Let's flatten it along the x-axis, like this. By default, you should be in model mode. In this mode, we can move objects around. For this, we can use the tools Move, Scale, and Rotate. They work approximately the same in all 3D programs. So, to avoid wasting time, use the shortcuts E, R, and T, respectively. To edit the geometry, we need to turn the cube primitive into an editable object. For this purpose, right-click and select Make Editable, or use the shortcut C. Now we can switch to other modes. Points, edges, and polygons also have transformation tools that work with them. You can find almost all of the modeling tools by right-clicking. In this case, these tools are for working with polygons, because we're in polygon mode. Let's highlight this polygon and you can move it along the individual axis. If you hold down Ctrl or Command and move, the polygon will extrude. Let's also extrude the polygon from above. If you want to extrude several polygons, hold down Shift and click on several of them. I'll just lift up a bit and roughly form the shape of the shoe for now. This is classic box modeling under subdivision. So let's create a subdivision surface. It appeared in the Object Manager, and to make it work, you need to make the cube as its child object. Just drag the cube directly into it. You can continue modeling right there and see how the object looks after the subdivision surface. Sometimes it's convenient to switch the display mode. I won't tell you all the modes, just try different display modes. You can find them in the display menu. For example, in Isoparms mode, we find it convenient to select the original polygons after subdivision. The heel is very round now, and I want to make a sharper transition. I'll disable subdivision surface temporarily by clicking this checkbox. And I want to add an edge loop along the edge to make a hard edge. To do this, I select the Loop Path Cut tool in Edge mode, or you can press M and L sequentially. And now click on the edge where you want the edge loop to go. Such edge loops are called support loops. As you can see, the edge is more rigid now. Then let's delete this polygon from the top. And we can see that the cube is becoming more and more like a shoe. Next, you should select Subdivision Surface and reduce these parameters down to 1. I want to see what it looks like with one iteration. I want to add another edge loop here, another edge loop in the shin area. Now select the subdivision surface and turn it into an editable object. And then we can edit the mesh created by the subdivision surface. We'll be more comfortable working with only one half, so double-click on this edge to select the edge loop. And in the Select menu, you can find a lot of ways of selection. For example, at the top of the list, you can see the classic rectangle selection. I use shortcut 0 for it. Let's now select Fill Selection. It allows you to select polygons separated by an edge loop. Let's highlight that half and delete it. Then let's create a symmetry object. And after that, we make our geometry as its child object. If you double-click the object, you can rename it. Now I'm going to correct the shape of the shoe a little by using the transformation tools. In the Point, Edges, and Polygon editing modes, select any transformation tool, and you can adjust soft selection. Also, in the attributes, you can adjust the influence radius. When working with soft selection, you should be careful with the points that are in the center of the symmetry. I'll create another subdivision surface and throw the symmetry into it. I want to add another edge loop to make the mesh more uniform. So I'll select this edge loop in the center and use the bevel tool. Let's select Loop Selection from the Select menu and highlight these 3 loop polygons. I want to flatten them a bit. But if we try to use Scale now, it will work relative to the center of the selected polygons. To move the pivot, click on Enable Axis. Therefore, we can place it in the center of the object. Notice the coordinate manager when I move the object. If we reset the X to 0, the pivot will move to the center. Let's disable Enable Axis, and now we can skew relative to this new pivot. Sometimes it's convenient to work in different projections. You can switch between them in the panel menu. Let's select, for example, All Views. Here you can see 4 projections, and you can switch between them with the F1, F2, F3, F4, and F5 keys to see all projections. And as always, I strongly suggest you memorize the hotkeys. And further, I'll speed up the video and correct the shape of the shoe. I won't change the topology or use any new tools. Mostly, I'll select points and edge, as well as use move. And sometimes I'll use soft selection. By the way, if you want to get rid of these shape breaks, go into Phong tag and uncheck the angle limit checkbox. Now I want to select this bottom part and flatten it. In order to do that, I'll use Scale. And then I'll scale on the y-axis by holding down Shift. So I can flatten it to exactly 0, and I'll do the same with this part here. Let's look at what we got. And let's make a sole. You can do this by duplicating the top part by holding Ctrl or Command. I'll rename it right away to avoid confusion, and press Viewport Solo to hide all objects except the highlighted ones. Double-click this edge to highlight this edge loop. I use Fill Selection to select the top and delete. Next, I'll highlight that outermost edge again and hold down Ctrl or Command to extrude it down. Select all the polygons, and if they're blue, that means they have inverted normals. To fix it, right-click and select Reverse Normals. Let's extrude this edge again, and now I'll use Scale to flatten it to 0. Then I'll remove these 2 polygons and make a heel out of it. Using Loop Path Cut to add an edge loop in the center. This is where I want the sole to be rounded. In addition, I'll add an edge loop at the base of the heel and adjust the shape a bit more. I want this shape at the bottom to be smooth, and so I want to run the edge loop along it. The topology doesn't allow us to use the Loop Path Cut to add this edge loop right now. Thus, let's make a piece of edge loop like this first, and then select the Line Cut tool in point mode. You can use it to click anywhere and draw the edge directly on the geometry. Now it's not edge loop yet, We need to correct some places like this, and it's easiest to use the polygon pen. I'll just combine the 2 points so they're linked together, and now polygon loop is here. Same thing in this place. I just put 2 points together here as well. And I use loops selection to make sure it's a polygon loop. Once again, I use loop path cut to add a couple of edge loops here, and I leave the corner sharp. Let's see how it all looks in Subdivision. I like everything, and all that remains is to close the holes at the bottom. Therefore, I'll select this edge loop starting at the corner and ending at this bend. Which means I have 2 more edges left here. I'll extrude them in X by holding Ctrl or Command and flatten them to 0. And move them to 0 on the X-axis, so that this edge loop is in the center of symmetry. I use loop path cut to add another edge loop along the edge from below. And it remains to close these 2 small holes. So use the polygon pen and click on these 2 points to create a polygon. Then use line cut to continue the edge loop this way. You should end up like this. And almost the same here. Use polygon pen, click on 2 points, create a polygon, then use line cut to complete the polygon loop. Now I'll take all the objects out of the subdivision surface and leave only the symmetry. After that, I'll select the symmetry objects and make them editable. And also get rid of those nulls that appeared. Now let's make a common subdivision surface. First, let's create it. If we put both objects inside, the subdivision surface will only change the object that is higher in the hierarchy. To fix this, select both objects and press Alt-G. They'll be grouped and become child objects of the new null. You can rename it. But now I also want to correct this edge. Let's select this edge and scrape it by holding down Ctrl or Command. This works just like extrude. So now I extrude down 2 times. I just want to have an edge loop here and also add an edge loop further along the edge. Additionally, I want to make the junction clearer, so I'll add another edge loop here. Overall, I'm satisfied with everything, and for now I think I'll remove the subdivision surface because we'll use another one in the scene. Now I want to move the shoe so that the sole is at 0 coordinates. But as you can see, the pivot also shifts. And to bring it back to 0, I use Enable Axis and reset the Y to 0. At this point, I can save the scene and name it Shoe. I'll create a new scene and model this fish. Well, to do that, I'll also create a cube and immediately create a subdivision surface. Normally, when you create a subdivision surface, it'll appear next to the object. But you can also create it by holding down Alt, then it'll immediately become the parent object of the selected object. I'll reduce the number of splits to 1 and convert it to an editable object. After that, using Extrude and the transformation tools, I'll shape the fish. Actually, it'd be much easier to make such a fish in ZBrush. I would just sculpt the fish out of a ball and then do a retopology. But the skill of box modeling is very useful because it teaches planning. I can't skip the initial stage, and that's why I work first with really large shapes and a small number of polygons. Also, I have to think about shape and topology at the same time. And when ZBrush wasn't there yet, in the age of 3D graphics, it was the only way to model at all. At this stage, I'll create another subdivision surface and correct the shape already under the subdivision. In some places, I'll add an edge loop to make the edges more rigid. I select the edge loop with a double click and use Fill Selection to select the separated polygons. At this point, I'll see how the fish looks with one subdivision. I'll make it editable, and now I'll work with a more highly polygonal mesh. At this stage, it'll be convenient to use Soft Selection. By the way, you can choose different fall-off interpolation in Soft Selection. In this way, it'll be convenient for me to use Needle. You can switch between the modes and see how they behave. At this point, I think there is too much edge loop. If you want to remove the edge loop, use the dissolve command. To make the lips, I just extruded these polygons here. And to make the connection tighter, I'll add support loops. I'll also correct it a little bit more. To make the fins, I'll create another cube, make it a little smaller, and move it up here. Immediately make it editable and delete the bottom polygon. By default, all objects move on local axis. You see, when I rotated the object, the axis rotated with it, and you can switch between local and world coordinates. For example, right now I'm rotating in world coordinates. This also works with move and scale. You see, the coordinates are parallel to the world axis, and if I press W, they're already parallel to the local coordinates of the object. You can also change the local coordinates manually. In the Coordinates tab, for example, I want to reset all rotation to 0. Let's position this object and make a fin out of it. As you see, it's convenient for me to scale it by local coordinates. I'll also make a subdivision surface for it. Make one partition and make it editable. And also variable it so I don't get confused with the objects. I'll switch to Enable Axis mode to move the coordinate axis to the base of the fin, and most importantly, don't forget to turn it off. And that way it'll be more comfortable positioning the fins. Let's create a new null and move all objects except subdivision surface there. So then make this null a child object of the subdivision surface. I'll rename the fin to fin top. Then I copy it by holding Ctrl or Command on Mac and make it into a bottom fin. I'll also rename it to fin bottom. I'll copy the top fin again and make a side fin out of it. I'll rename it too. For the eye, I use a sphere. I rotate it 90 degrees so that the pole is looking at us and reduce it a bit. Alright, I'll switch to solo mode and simulate the eye. I'll leave the number of segments at 16 and make it editable. I select this edge loop and use Fill Selection to select these polygons. Then using Ctrl or Command C and Ctrl or Command V to duplicate, I'll select the outermost edge loop and extrude. This will be the pupil. I'll rename the whole object and move it to null with all the other objects. I just move it out for convenience. Now I'll copy this whole eye with Ctrl or Command, delete the pupil, and remove half of the eye to make an eyelid. I'll isolate all the polygons using Extrude. I'll rename it to eyelid. And I think I'll remove the back part, because it won't be visible anyway. I'll check how it looks in Subdivision. And this multi-pointed star won't smooth out very well. And if you want, you can fix it. So I'll select all these edges here and use the dissolve command to remove them. Then I use line cut to draw an edge loop. Now I have quadrilaterals everywhere, and the eyelids are smoothed out much better. Likewise, I want to add an edge loop along the edge to make it a little sharper. Next, I'll make eyelid as a child object of the eye object. After that, it'll be convenient for me to move and scale the eye together with the eyelid. I'll just position it as I like and maybe flatten it a bit at local coordinates. Let's create a symmetry object and put it in null with the rest of the objects and make the eye its child object. If the symmetry plane isn't chosen correctly, you can change this in the attributes. I'll rename the symmetry object to eyes. I like the way it looks. I'll remove the subdivision surface for now. I also forgot to reflect that fin. To do this, I'll just copy the eyes object and delete the eye geometry from it, and then make the fin its child object. Also rename it to fins. And after that, I'll save the scene and name it fins. To create the disco ball, we'll use the cloner. Let's first create a cube. I'll make it 15 by 15 and 2 centimeters thick. This will be the mirror that will clone around the ball. Then hold down Alt and create a cloner. The cloner clones all child objects. In the Attributes Manager in the Object panel, change the mode to radial. Here you can also change the radius and number of clones. I'll start with a radius of 100 and make sure that these mirrors are touching each other a bit. I can still change the parameters of the cube, and in this case I want to add a fillet. I'll also reduce the number of splits and the radius of the fillet. I want to make all edges between polygons sharp. Therefore, I'll delete the Phong tag. Such sharp edges will add more detail to the reflection. Let's create a reference ball. Its radius is also 100 centimeters, and I'll expose 64 segments. We won't use subdivision surface on it. And then I just want to copy these cloners and reduce its radius. So in the Transform tab, you can manually change the orientation of these cloners. But there's an easier way to do it faster. Highlight the cloners and create a target effect. In the cloner attributes, make sure that it's in the effectors list. If it isn't, just drag the effector to that list. And now the z-axis of all the clones will be looking at this target effector. If we copy the cloner, all new clones will automatically be oriented towards this target. Now it remains only to copy the cloners and adjust its radius, and the number of clones so that they don't overlap with the sphere and with each other. Now I'm going to reorganize all the hierarchies a little bit to make it more visual. You can rotate some of the cloners to add more randomness and realism. Let's now select all the cloners and create another effector called random. We go to the parameter tab, and by default it affects position. Let's turn it off and turn on rotation. I just want all the mirrors to be rotated slightly differently, as if they were manually applied. It'll be enough to set 1 or 2 degrees here. It's not very noticeable now, but when they reflect, it'll look a little more natural. Now I want to reflect all these mirrors to the other half. So I'll first create a null and put all the cloners except the center one there. And then again, using the symmetry object, and most importantly, choose the correct symmetry plane. Let's see what it looks like. And if you're pleased with everything, you can combine it all into one object. I'll select all the objects except the sphere and choose Connect Objects plus Delete. And I'll rename the new object to Mirrors. I'll also create a new null, put these 2 objects in it, and rename it Disco Ball. And to create the mount, I'll use the sphere again. Here I'll speed up the video, because it's pretty obvious. Here I make a subdiv as a habit, but it's not necessary, because the disco ball will be quite far away. It won't be visible very well. Thus, I also placed this new object in the null disco ball. So now we can save the project. I'll call it disco ball. I'll use a cube to create the speakers. Right away, I'll make it editable. Highlight this bottom polygon and move it to 0 in Y. I did this because I want the coordinate axis to be on the floor. So now I'll create a bevel modifier. If you make it a child object of a cube, it'll round all the edges of that cube. Here you can adjust the rounding radius and the number of subdivisions. But what if you don't want to round all edges, but only some specific ones? Well, for that, let's select the cube, and in the Edges mode, we'll select the edges we want to round. After that, in the Select menu, click Store Selection. A selection tag should appear on a cube object. It stores the selection of your edges. If I reset the selection and double-click this tag, it'll come back. You can also store the selection of the polygons and points. Next, select Bevel and make sure it's in Edges mode, and drop the tag into that box. Now we only have the selected edges rounded. And we can also adjust the radius, subdivision, and so on. We can also keep editing the geometry of this cube. For example, I can copy this part and edit it as I want. And most importantly, make sure that the right edges are selected in Selection tag, or select them again manually. Now I'll use the sphere to create the loudspeaker. I'll click on that little point to hide the cube. I'll create a subdivision surface to see how that smoothing works and delete it right away. Once the speaker is ready, I'll position it in the right place. I'll copy it temporarily to see how they fit. And I'll probably shrink it down a little bit more. Here we have a problem. The speaker intersects with the body and we need to cut a hole. Let's temporarily hide the speaker for now and create a cylinder. I'll reduce the number of height segments, and we'll use this cylinder to cut a hole in this box. Also, I'll rename the objects to avoid confusion and rename the cylinder to Cut. Then, if we want to cut the objects from each other, we create a bool object and drop the cylinder and the box into it. By default, it cuts the second object from the first, which means that the cylinder should be lower in hierarchy than the box. After that, I want to place the cylinder in the same place as the loudspeaker. Let's temporarily disable bool for now and hide the box, and take the cylinder out of the hierarchy. In the Coordinates tab, you can change the local coordinates of the object. If I currently drop them to 0, the cylinder will be at 0 coordinates. But if I make it a child object of the loudspeaker, the coordinates will no longer be 0. This means that the local coordinates are calculated against the parent object. If we now drop them to 0, the cylinder will be at the same coordinates as the speaker. And then you can make it a child object of bool again. All that remains is to adjust the radius of the cylinder a little bit. I'll make it a little bit smaller than the size of the loudspeaker. If I want to make a second hole and try to copy the cylinder, then you'll see that it doesn't cut out. This is because bool can work only with two objects. And to fix this, let's create a null and put the cylinder inside it and copy it inside null. This way bool will recognize null as a whole object. However, in addition to the cylinder, we also need to copy the speaker. So I'll undo the changes for now. Select the cylinder and the loudspeaker. Hold down Ctrl or Command on Mac and duplicate both objects at the same time. Then the new objects will each be in their own hierarchy. What if I want to add some interactivity and, for example, I want to change one loudspeaker and have the second one change the same way? Let me rename the top loudspeaker, then highlight the bottom one and hold Alt and create an instance object. When I held down Alt, the instance was created in the same coordinates as the bottom speaker. And now I don't need it anymore. I delete it. And let's rename the instance to speaker instance. In the instance attributes, in the object tab, you should select reference object, and now this object works as a reference to the top speaker. If I change it, the bottom one will also change. We'll need this during the animation. In some cases, this interactive way of modeling is very convenient if you want to make many different variations. For example, now I can still edit the bevel radius and so on. But in this case, I don't need that interactivity, I just want to add some details to the body. So I'll select the box and bevel and choose Connect Objects plus Delete. Now this is a new mesh that I can work with. I'll just add some details by the modeling tools. In this kind of modeling with bool, we still have a lot of polygons, and pay attention, we cannot use the subdivision surface. It's because the topology isn't suitable for this. Therefore, I reorganize the hierarchy so that I have two objects. In this null, we'll have objects under the subdiv, in this case two loudspeakers. And the second object is bool, which will remain as it is. I'll also create another null to put all the objects there. Also, make sure that this null is in the center of the coordinates. After that, we can save the project. I'll save it as loudspeaker. I'll also use a sphere of 16 polygons for the glass. At first, I form the upper part of the glass. If we want to render the glass realistically, it has to have a thickness. And we can use extrude, but as you see, it just shifts the selected polygons along the normals. And to keep the outside of the glass, I just duplicate the object and extrude one of them inside. Now I'll select both of these objects and press Connect Objects plus Delete to merge them into one mesh. As you can see, this geometry isn't connected yet, and we need to weld the points around the edge. For this purpose, in point mode, you should select all the points and press Optimize. Now it's a solid piece, but some normals are inverted. Use Align Normals to flip all the normals to one side. If they're inverted, like mine, use Reverse Normals. If you have done everything correctly, all polygons should be yellow. Now I'll add support loops and see how it looks after subdivision. Now I can finish the foot. Here at the bottom, we don't have to cover the hole. It won't be visible anyway. I'll just add edge loops in all of the places where I want hard edges. I also want to add a drink. In order to do that, I'll copy this glass and hide the original one. Then I'll highlight the polygon loop around and delete it. Now the inner and outer part aren't connected. We can double-click on any polygon to select all polygons of the outer part and delete. So now I'll close the hole at the top. This is where I want to make a good topology. In order to close the hole, I use close polygon hole. We have a polygon. I use line cut to make a normal topology. At first, I'll make the edge crosswise and then I'll add 2 on each side. Then all polygons will be quadrangular. I'll also add support loops along the edge. Let's see what subdivision looks like. You can see that this place doesn't look good. If you want to practice, you can also make a good topology. But this glass is very small and I'll leave it as it is. Here I highlighted all the polygons and noticed that the normals are reversed. So I use align normals and reverse normals. Additionally, I want to adjust the height of the liquid, and if you want to see through the glass, you can use the X-ray. It is located in the Basic tab. I'll adjust the height of the drink simply by moving these points. Another aspect is that now this fluid is close to the glass, and when rendering transparent materials, artifacts can occur because of this. In order to avoid this, the liquid has to penetrate a little bit inside the glass. For this, I'll highlight all the polygons and use extrude to squeeze them out a bit. And now I'll delete the subdivision surface as usual. I'll rename the objects, group them in null, also, I want the foot of the glass to be at 0 coordinates. Well, I'll select both of these objects and in polygon mode select all polygons and move the glass up. This way I keep the local coordinates of the objects at 0 coordinates. Finally, after that, I save the scene. We modeled all the objects for the scene. Now let's go back to the character. Let's open the last OBJ file that we got after sweeping in 3D Coat. Let's check it again, one more time to be sure. The selection sets corresponding to the UV sets in 3D Coat should be saved on this object. You can double-click them to highlight the polygons, and you can notice the corresponding names. These 3 materials are applied to the corresponding UV sets, and this tag is the most important one. Don't delete it under any circumstance. If you go into UV edit mode, you should see your sweep. It's contained exactly in this tag. The tag with the normals should be removed. And in the Phong tag, disable angle limit. I'll rename the object to body. We're still missing the hair, the mouth, and the eyes. If you remember, we saved the Party Maker C4D scene. This scene has no sweep. We exported it from ZBrush and prepared it for 3D Coat. But it has hair and mouth. Let's double-click on hair and mouth polygons to select them. Then press Ctrl or Command X to cut the polygons. Then undo the selection from the object and press Ctrl or Command C. This will create a separate object out of those polygons. Now we can copy it again and paste it into the scene with UV sweeps. I'll immediately rename this object to hair. Now the coordinate axis is in the center of the object. I want to move it this way, so that it stands on the floor. In order to do this, I'll first make the hair as a child object, so that I can move the body along with the hair more conveniently. After that, I'll move the body by sight. Then I switch on Enable Axis and move the body axis to 0 coordinates. The main thing is to change them not here in the local coordinates, but here in the Coord Manager. It's also important that the axes don't move relative to the center of the character. For hair, I'll move the axis just to the center of the hair. Do it by sight. Also, at this stage, it's very important to make the right scale of the character. This will greatly affect how the materials and animations look. In my case, his height of 158 centimeters is very close to what I need, so I won't change it. Now I can take the hair out of body. Let's also redo the mouth. For this purpose, create a circle object and position it in the mouth area. Now you can make it editable, and in edit mode you can move it. This is very similar to working with curves in Adobe Illustrator. I'll shape the mouth and then we'll add a thickness to this spline. You can add a point by holding Ctrl or Command and clicking on the spline. I won't tell you about all the spline tools. You can also find them by right-clicking and exploring. If you want, you can use this spline to animate the mouth. But I won't animate it, so I'll leave the 4 points. Now let's create another circle and use it to add spline thickness. This circle will play the role of a section. Now create a sweep object. If you put 2 splines in it, then one spline will extrude along the second spline as a guide. I'll rename these splines to mouth and cross. Then make them child objects of the sweep object. In the sweep spline object, the section must be above the guide in the hierarchy. In this case, cross must be above mouth. We can also edit the radius of this circle. In the Object tab of each spline, we can change the number of polygons. In this case, for circle, I'll put 2 points, and for mouth, I'll make a bit more. After that, we still have the possibility to edit the shape of the spline. You can use this to animate the mouth. I'll rename the sweep to mouth, and like with the other objects, I'll use Enable Axis to move all coordinate axes to the center of the mouth, so that I can work with it more comfortably. I'll adjust the mouth to the shape of the face a little more. Now we don't need the old mouth anymore, so I'm gonna isolate it and remove the old mouth geometry. I'll create a sphere to make an eye. I'll do it in about the same way I did the eye for the fish, but I won't flatten it. I rename the object to eye. I create another null before copying it. I'll call it head and move it approximately to the center of the head. All objects that are separated from the body will be stored in it. In this case, it's the eyes, the mouth, and the hair. Instead of using symmetry, I'll first copy the x-coordinate of the eye. Then I copy the eye and paste that coordinate, only with a minus sign. This will come in handy if you want to animate the direction of the gaze. And I'll also rename these eyes to R and L, respectively. When I first started doing this course, I wasn't going to talk about rigging and animation. On the other hand, it's 2 huge individual topics, and other guys will talk about them in the course of this series. But then we decided that it would be awesome if one of you could make a cool animation and post it on Instagram. That's why I'll give you some tricks to make your scene come to life without any in-depth knowledge of animation. I'll also talk about some of the basics of animation, and since I didn't originally intend to animate this character, its pose isn't very suitable for rigging. This is why we're gonna have to adjust it a little bit. But since we've already done the UV sweeps, if you don't want to redo them, we'll need to correct the shape very carefully. I'll demonstrate roughly what we should get. In order to have good rigging, you have to keep the arms pointing sideways, the elbows slightly bent, and the palms of the hands pointing down. It goes something like this, but in doing so, we have the topology twisted here, and also we need to do it somehow without destroying the UV sweep. Let's switch to UV edit mode, and select this body material. You may notice that I have a seam that separates the arm in the shoulder area. This means that we can cut the arm along this seam and it won't ruin this sweep. Let's select this edge loop. Let's right-click and choose Disconnect. Now the hand is a separate object and we can rotate it. We'll cut off the right hand in the same way. Let's select the edge loop and press disconnect. Unfortunately, we can't model symmetrically in CinemaScope. So we make the left hand first and then copy it to the right side. After that, I'll slightly straighten the arm at the elbow. Here I use loop selection and fill selection. You should also remember to highlight this bandage. And then I also use enable axis to move the pivot to where the elbow is rotated. So I'll just roughly rotate these polygons for now. After that, I'll have to manually correct those edge loops. Finally, I'll select the entire arm and also use enable axis to move the pivot to the shoulder area. I'll rotate the arm like this. I want the edge loop that goes through the middle finger to connect to the edge loop that goes through the ear. That's basically what I have. I'm just gonna adjust these two edge loops a little bit more. Remember, don't edit the geometry in the body area in any way. This is because this should have the same left and right side, so that we can attach the reflected hand. All in all, it's not bad. It's a little crooked, but we'll fix that now. Now let's attach these two edge loops. First, select them, and then select the Stitch and Sew tool. Thereafter, click on the point on the arm and drag towards the loop on the shoulder. The main thing is to keep this loop the same as it was at the beginning. Just remember where it is and try not to change it. Now let's fix these neighboring loops. It looks very crooked. You can highlight it and use the iron tool. If you click on it and start pulling, it'll center itself between the neighboring edge loops. I also use slide to move it a little closer to the shoulder, so that the proportions of the polygons are about the same as on the other arm. It'll avoid a lot of deformation of the UV sweeps as well. Let's do the same with the rest of the loops. At first, I'll adjust it a bit manually and then use iron. Let's go into UV edit mode. Now we have the right hand highlighted. Let's remove it. As you can see, the sweeps are also deleted, but that's okay, we'll restore them. Let's now copy the left hand. We select the edge loop around the stitch and use fill selection. Likewise, don't forget to select this bandage. If you want to reflect the polygons inside the object, we'll use the mirror command. The main thing here is to choose the correct symmetry plane and press apply. And you should have the selected polygons reflected. However, notice that the sweep of the new hand is in the same place as the sweep of the old hand. And since we haven't started making textures yet, we can just repackage these UV tiles. To select all polygons of this UV set, double-click on Selection Set Body. Select the tag with the body material to see only those polygons in the UV editor. Next, here in the UV Packing tab, select Geometric, and also here at the bottom, put a check mark on Preserve Orientation so that the tiles don't rotate after packaging, and then click Apply. This works very similarly to how Pack UV works in 3D Coat. All that's left is to weld all the dots so that the body becomes a whole object again. For this purpose, I highlight them and use Optimize. In my case, this didn't work. Apparently because the left and right sides were asymmetrical. If it's the same for you, you can just highlight that edge loop, push it back a bit, and use Stitch and Sew. By the way, I forgot one more thing. Here we have these bandages in a different UV set. They're in the UV set cloth. And they're also in the same place right now. And here I won't repack. I'll just highlight this new bandage and move it to whatever space is available. This is most likely where the old bandage was. The main thing is that it shouldn't overlap with the borders and with other UV tiles. Let's save this scene and we'll look at it in the future. I'll call this scene Party Maker. That's the end of the unpleasant work, and now I'll show you something cool. Go to Google and type Mixamo. And the first site on the list should be Mixamo.com. This site has a huge library of characters. You can choose any character, and also here you can choose any animation for that character. By the way, I forgot to mention that you'll need to register on this site. It's free. But the cool thing is that you can load your own character and Mixamo will automatically do rig and you can use any of these animations. Let's go back to our scene and make sure it's saved and temporarily remove the hair for now. I only want to export the body object. Let's export it as an OBJ. After that, on the Mixamo site, click Upload Character and drop your file into this window. It may take some time to upload and process the model. Make sure that the character is facing the camera. You can use these arrows to do this and click Next. Now place these markers accordingly. That is, chin is in the chin area, wrists in the wrist area, and so on. Click Next, and based on this information, Mixamo will create an automatic rig for your character. This may also take a while. In my opinion, it looks pretty cool for a free rig in 5 seconds. You can click here to see the rig itself. Don't expect everything to be perfect, because it can take weeks of work for a professional to rig a character. Now you can choose any animation you want, and I'll select the dance section in the search and choose a particular dance. On the right side, you can also find some settings and adjust the speed, raise the arms higher, and so forth. The default animation here is 30 frames per second. If you want to make a perfect loop, for example for Instagram, it's desirable that the total number of frames is divided by 30. Here you can see the number of frames. I'll adjust the override slider so that there are exactly 90 frames here. If the animation you chose is longer, you can choose, for example, 120. Well, I have 90 frames now. I'll take another look at what the animation looks like and we can click Download. The default format here is FBX 30 frames per second. Leave everything by default and click Download. Let's load the downloaded file into Cinema and see what happens. Here in the Project tab, make sure the FPS is 30. You can find these settings in Mode, Project. Make sure we have 90 frames, 0 through 89. Press play to view the animation. Everything looks pretty cool to me. Let's take a look at what we have in Object Manager. You can find the skeleton itself here. These are the different bones that affect the geometry. They control the geometry points through the skin modifier, which is inside the body object. If I disable the skin modifier, the geometry returns to its original position. Here I won't tell you about the details, and the main thing to understand is that there is nothing superfluous here. So let's create a null and call it animation. Let's put all these objects here, and I'll also name the geometry, so as not to confuse it with the original geometry. Now let's copy this null and open the scene we saved before exporting it to Mixamo. There is still hair in it. In this scene, it's also important to make sure that it's at 30 FPS. And press Ctrl or Command C to insert the animation. You should get it so that if you turn off the skin, then the geometry should match perfectly. Let's hide the bones for now by clicking on that little circle. And you may have noticed that on the animation geometry, we no longer have selection tag and materials. Sometimes when exporting to different programs, it happens that the indexes of all points and polygons are violated. And for example, if we try to copy one selection tag to a new geometry, it'll most likely select polygons incorrectly. As you see, here we have wheels, and here it's not clear what's selected. The same thing with the clothes. In this case, it's not clear what's highlighted either. There are several ways to solve this problem. We can manually select all polygons and create selection sets, and then assign materials to them. But since the animation is quite simple and we won't change it anymore, we can use one hack. Let's create a surface object. Make it a child of the body object. Then turn off the skin of the animation object. The meshes should completely coincide now. Next, in the surface object, select the animation object as surface and click Initialize. If you enable skin and play the animation, the body object will be deformed in the same way as the animation object. Now I can hide all objects related to animation, and we'll use the body object for rendering. We still have the head object, which is still hanging in the air, and we need to bind it to the head in some way. To do this, we can return all the bones to the T-pose. In order to do this, select Weight tag and press Reset Bind Pose. The main thing isn't to mix it up with Set Bind Pose. If you press this button, you'll break the rigging. I want to bind the head object to the head bone. Now I'll temporarily hide all geometry, animation, and body, and make the bones visible. I want to bind my hair to this bone. For this, we need to find it in the hierarchy. So select the bone in Viewport and press S. It'll be highlighted in yellow. Now I'll undo the selection and select the head object first, and then hold down the Shift on this bone. The sequence of selection is important. Then go to the Character, Constraints tab, and click Add Parent Constraint. This tag should appear on the head object. And in the attributes of this tag in the Targets field, you should see this bone. So this bone should control the position of the head object. Everything looks good. The only thing is that I have these places that are very deformed, and we can correct them very quickly too. Create a Delta Mush object and make it a child object of the animation object. It should come after skin in the hierarchy. Delta Mush smooths polygons that deform quite significantly. The main thing here isn't to go too far with the settings, so that it doesn't smooth out places that don't need to be smoothed. With this approach, there are lots of little problems that have to be solved in all sorts of unconventional ways. That's the price we pay for such fast rigging and animation. Remember to save the scene now, just in case. Let's assemble the composition from all the objects we've already modeled. We're going to have a static camera, so let's set up the view first. And let's create the camera. As you can see, the camera object appeared, and it appeared in the place where you were looking at the character. If you want to turn on the camera view, click on that square. Let's say I want to make a video for Instagram. So let's go into the render settings and set the resolution 1024 by 1024 right away. And we're going to do the composition immediately for the format. Let's highlight the camera and see what attributes it has. It has lots of settings. You can explore them. But in this case, all we need to do is change the focal length a bit. This is something you can adjust for your own taste. Here I want to make a longer focal length lens. Moreover, in this mode, when navigating in the viewport, you'll move the camera. Therefore, be careful. Note that the camera coordinates change, so watch when this mode is on and when it's off, so as not to accidentally move the camera. We have a homogeneous background on the reference, so let's create a plane and make it a floor that goes smoothly into the wall. Here I'll put one segment at a time and make it editable. Then I'll scale it up a bit and move it back. Now I extrude this edge up and add edge loops. Right here on the edge. That's where we're going to have the rounding. And I'll also add edge loops along the edges. So the idea is that if I create a subdivision surface, this object will turn into a studio like this. I can highlight these edge loops and control the rounding radius that way. Remember to see how it looks from the camera and adjust the camera and plane if necessary. Finally, we can import our models. The nice thing about Cinema is that we can select all the files at once and drop them into the Cinema window, and they'll open as different projects. Since we have everything in separate renamed nulls, we can just copy those nulls and paste them into the scene. After that, we can place them. It'll also be easy for us to find them in hierarchy by name. To simplify the hierarchy, let's create a null and call it character, and put everything related to the character in it. That's animation. body and head. I'll also rename this subdivision surface as background. Pay attention that all the objects we have now are not in scale. And I'm not scaling the character, but the objects under the character, because we've already set it to the right height. Before that, we always moved objects in model mode. And note, when we scale the object, its scale coordinates don't change. That is, here we always have units. This means that the points themselves inside the geometry are scaled, and for parametric objects, all parameters are simply recalculated. We have a lot of speakers on reference. They're all the same, but at different scales. And it'll be convenient for us to use instance because it's essentially the same speaker. This way we'll be able, for example, to animate loudspeakers, and they'll animate in the same way in all instances. Now let's select a speaker and create an instance. If we try to scale the original speaker in model mode now, we see that instance is scaled too. At the same time, if we try to scale instance, it doesn't work at all. And to scale it separately, we'll use object mode. When scaling in this mode, the scale value changes. This way we can scale instances independently of each other. And now when we have the original speaker and one instance, I'll copy the instance. Then I'll put all the speakers in the scene. I can animate the original instance and all the instances will change with it. I have arranged all the objects in the scene. Let's bet on the hierarchy. Here I have a shoe and there's a fish. You can't see it. If you want to see it in the viewport, you can select Sol and turn on the X-ray. Also disco ball. I put the speakers in one null. Here I have one original speaker and 4 instances. There is also a glass, a background, and a character. If you're satisfied with the composition and the camera and no longer want to change the camera position, you can lock the camera movement, so as not to accidentally move it. This is done by highlighting the camera and creating a protection tag. Now if I try to rotate it in the viewport, it doesn't rotate. And in the same way, you can protect any object. For example, I don't want to move a character anymore. I'll just copy this tag. Now if I try to move it, it won't work. We've already done the character animation. And for the real party to start, we need to animate some more objects in the scene. Let me talk about some animation basics on the example of this fish. As an example, I want to animate it like this on the y-axis. Let's move the timeline to frame 0, and I, for example, here have set 30 frames, which is exactly equal to 1 second. Now click on this circle next to the y-coordinate. You can see that a keyframe has been created in frame 0. The Y value has been written in it. Now move the timeline to frame 15, move the fish along the Y-axis, and create another keyframe. Therefore, if I move the timeline, the position of this fish will be interpolated between the 2 keyframes. We can select, for example, the first frame in the timeline and hold down Ctrl or Command on Mac to copy it to the last frame. In this way, we can make a loop. This way you can animate any parameter. And for local coordinates, there's a separate button that animates all those parameters at the same time. You press Record Active Objects, and you may notice that keyframes have been created at once on all the parameters. All these circles have turned red. If you want, you can animate this way, although I prefer to animate only the parameters that I want. If I try to move the fish now and then scroll timeline, it'll move back. That's because all the local coordinates of this fish are written in these keyframes. And I'll show you another detail. For demonstration purposes, I'll create a null, and somehow randomly move and rotate it. If I put this fish in this null now, the fish will be animated relative to the local coordinates of this null. So it's important to remember that these are the local coordinates relative to the parent object. So if you want to move the object after you animate it, you have to animate it immediately relative to the parent null. Note that, for example, in keyframe 15, I have one keyframe. But at the same time, I know for sure that there are a bunch of different parameters. In this case, their position, rotation, and scale. If you want to change them individually, press Shift F3. Here you can see a list of all animated objects and their animated parameters individually. If you click this icon, you'll see only selected objects in this list. Now fish is selected and its position is animated. Here you can change X, Y, Z individually. Similarly, scale and rotation. As an example, I don't want to have rotation and scale recorded. I can just delete them. And now you see that there are no more keyframes. I also removed the X and Z animation and put only position Y. Here you can copy frames just like in Timeline. And there is one more mode, and that is F-curve mode. This is the exact same list of animated objects and their parameters. But the difference is that here you can change the interpolation between frames. At this point, if I play the animation, you'll see that the fish slows down and speeds up. I can stretch these handles, for example, to make the graph more extreme and exaggerate this effect. See how it speeds up between keyframes and slows down closer to keyframes? You can also choose automatic interpolation in this panel. Let's choose linear interpolation for the example. Then the fish will move without acceleration at a linear speed. Let's do something more interesting than the up and down motion. Create a bend modifier and throw it inside the fish. The bend modifier will affect all objects that are inside this null fish. Rotate it so that the long arrow looks towards the tail. This modifier simply bends the object. Currently, it doesn't work quite right. We need to rotate it 90 degrees. To make the fish not deform as much, turn on Keep Length and adjust its proportions to the shape of the fish. Now we can animate this strength parameter. In frame 0, I'll do -30, and in frame 15, I'll do 30. Then I'll copy frame 0 to do loop. I'll also adjust the shape of the curve a bit. I have 30 frames at this scene, but in the main scene I'll have 90 frames. I want this animation to loop repeatedly. You can easily select these frames and copy them 3 times. But if your animation is finer and needs to be repeated, for example 20 times, it'll be easier to select this curve here, right-click on the parameters and select After Repeat. This way your animation will be repeated. And you can do the same thing before repeat. Overall, the animation looks good, but we can add even more life using the bend modifier. I'll move this modifier away for now, and I only want it to affect the tail. You can move the curve points vertically. That way, you can quickly control the strength of the bend. Namely, you can try different modes. For example, unlimited, when the bend will bend the reverse side as well. Okay, I'll copy this bend, and this new bend will also affect this fish. I'll disable the old bend for now and adjust the new one. Now I want the whole fish to bend here. I want the whole fish to bend, but I also want the tail animation to lag a bit. In order to do that, I'll shift the whole animation of the new bend back a little. This should add a little more realism. Then, after a little adjustment, I got an animation like this. I still want to add Y movement. To do that, I'll create null and animate the fish inside it. I'll just repeat the same thing we've already done. I'll put a keyframe in frame 0 and in frame 15, and copy frame 0 into the 30th frame. After that, I'll highlight the entire curve and choose After Repeat After. I just copied this animation and pasted it into the scene as is. If you want, you can work directly in this project and do the animation here. But it's more handy for me to work in separate projects so that I don't get confused with the hierarchy of objects. Well, we have a fish floating in the air. I want to make and animate the water. And in order to make the water look realistic, at first we need to make the thickness of this glass sole. Thus, I just copy this sole, select all the polygons, and use normal move. It simply moves all the polygons along the normals. In my case, I'll move them about a centimeter inward. This object will be the inner surface of the glass. So we need to invert the normals of these polygons. Namely, I use reverse normals and the polygons should be blue. I'll copy again this inner part and hide it for now. From it, I'll make water later. And now I connect the inside and the outside. For this, I use connect objects and delete. Do you remember what I said about how water should penetrate the glass a bit? So I'll select this object from which I was going to make water using normal move and move the polygons back slightly. Now I'll rename the object to water and we need to flip the normal back. Thus, I once again use reverse normals, that is, they should be yellow this time. Now I'll create a cube and fit it to the shape of the shoe, like this. Then I'll create a bool object and cut that cube out of the shoe. This will be our water level. Since we have bad topology after bool, we can't use subdivision surface. So we have to use subdivision surface before we cut the cube. Next, I want the surface of the water to not be so flat. I want to warp it somehow. This will require us to add more polygons to this cube. To start, I'll make about this amount. Then create a displacer modifier and put it inside the cube. You can use the displacer to warp the geometry using height maps. Select Custom Shader here and select Shader Noise here. If I turn off bool, this is what our cube looks like now. Now we can edit this noise and displacer settings and do the animation. Let's go to the Shading tab and see the noise settings. Here I'd only need to adjust the global scale. Furthermore, in the displacer settings, you can change the strength of the effect. If you have so many polygons, the animation will be very slow. And you can reduce the number of polygons if you want. Here, you just have to pick up the size of the polygons, the size of noise, and the power of influence by eye, so that the animation doesn't slow down too much and you have enough detail. For adding animation, let's go to the noise settings. And here there is animation speed. I'll start with 1 and check how the animation looks. When working with bool, you can often get all sorts of glitches like this on the mesh, and there's no standard way to deal with them. You just have to adjust the size of the polygons, and try to move these objects around a bit and see if these glitches are less. Since we want to make a looped animation, the noise parameters also have loop settings. This parameter, loop period, as well as animation speed are measured in seconds. Our animation will last 3 seconds, so I'll choose 3. You can play the animation and see how the first and last frames fit together. Now I'll correct the parameters some more and try to work on the speed of the animation. I'll also have to move the mesh to get rid of these glitches. I moved it up a little higher and there were fewer glitches. And finally, my animation looks like this. We can do exactly the same thing for the animation of the water in the glass. But here we don't need bool because we have enough polygons for deformation. That's why I immediately created displacer and also immediately created noise. Now the displacer affects all the points at the same time. In fact, we can choose which points we want Displacer to affect. I'll select all of these upper points. And then on the Select menu, click Store Selection. Finally, in the Displacer, we need to create a tag, restriction tag, and put selection set into this tag. So now the Displacer only acts on the right points, but they move in all the wrong directions. This is because the shift direction is currently vertex normal. We need to select planar and select the desired axis. In this case, plus y. Okay, now everything works and all that's left is to adjust the displacement strength and noise. And then, in order to animate the speakers, I'll select the original speaker and find this speaker. In this speaker, I'll highlight this piece. I want to animate it like this. The easiest way to animate it with the Pose Morph tag. You can find it in the Rigging tag. In this tag, turn on points, and in Edit mode, you have two poses now. Base pose, this is the original mesh. If you switch to pose 0 and change the mesh, the new position of the points is saved in the Pose Morph tag. This way you can create several different poses and switch between them. Like, for example, I can switch to base pose and return the original geometry. Then, in Animate mode, you can mix the two poses. And the cool thing is that you can animate the slider too. It's pretty simple here. I'll put a keyframe of frame 0. Then I'll change this pose in frame 15 and add another keyframe. Subsequently, I'll already correct this animation. I'll immediately make a loop. For this, I'll select curves and put repeat after and repeat before. Then I just adjust the shape of the curve, so I like the animation. I also decided to reduce loop and make it for 15 frames. 19 is also divisible by 15. And it remains to animate the most important disco ball. Here I just animate rotations on the vertical axis. I put the keyframe in frame 0 and rotate 360 degrees in frame 90. And I also put the keyframe. Now the rotation of the ball is speeding up and slowing down, but I want to make it even. Well, I'll correct the curve and do a linear interpolation. Basically, the scene is ready for texturing and rendering. As a bonus, I'll give you some more ideas that you can experiment with in the animation. By way of example, in the case of the speaker, I can create a squash and stretch modifier. And you can see there's a bunch of settings, and in this case you can animate the slider slightly. I mean just a little bit, so it doesn't have a very cartoonish effect. You can create absolutely any shape of spline for more interesting animation of the fish, and then use this spline as a trajectory of the fish's movement. You need tag align to spline to do this. In this field, you just select spline and now you can animate this slider position. To orient the fish on the spline, click tangential. If it's not rotated correctly, just rotate the inner null of the fish relative to the outer null. You can also, for example, animate the camera position and add a shake like this under the bit. This time I just animated the y-axis. And my curve looks quite simple.